Chapter 1. A Dog Show. 12-year-old Pete Hollister bolted out of the front door of his home, pulling a cap over his blonde crew-cut hair. As he hurried down the porch steps of the large, rambling house, he almost ran into his father. "Whoa!" commanded Mr. Hollister with a laugh. The boy came to a sudden stop, sitting down hard on the bottom step. "Hi, Dad! How come you're home so early in the afternoon?" Mr. Hollister chuckled and put an arm about Pete's shoulder. "Gather the clan together, and I'll tell you the secret that brought me home so early," he said. Pete did an excellent roundup, and within 10 minutes the entire family, including Zip, their collie dog, was in the pleasant living room, where a fire burned merrily on the hearth. There was Pam, a lovely 10-year-old girl with golden blonde hair and brown eyes. Then came Ricky, who at 7 was the daredevil of the family. His freckled face and reddish hair were as likely to be seen upside down as right side up. Next to this lively lad sat 6-year-old Holly. Her brown pigtails fairly quivered with eagerness as she awaited the important news of the day, and her cheeks were as red as the apple she held in her hand. Last and littlest of all was Sue, who had come into the room with her attractive blonde mother. Climbing onto her father's knees, she put her arms around his neck as he began to speak. "Well, Happy Hollisters," he began, "it looks as though your February vacation from school might be very extra special this year." "Oh, tell us," Holly begged. "How would you all like to spend your vacation in Florida?" he asked. "Florida?" 5 excited voices exclaimed as one. Mrs. Hollister was as surprised as the 4 oldest children. Sue, however, did not seem to understand, and asked her father, "What's Florida? How did you spend it?" Pete answered her quickly. "It's a place way down south where it's summer all the time," he explained. And then added, "Boy, that sounds super, Dad, but what's the story?" "A customer of mine wants to buy a houseboat, and he'll pay a fine price to get a good one. He's been advertising in out-of-town papers and making inquiries everywhere, but so far he hasn't had any luck. This afternoon he had a letter from a man who has a houseboat to sell. This man's a clown with the Sunshine Circus on Circus Island in Florida. My customer can't get away from business right now, so he's asked me to fly down there and have a look at the boat. How'd you all like to go along?" "Yikes! Swell! Wonderful! Goody! Hooray!" The entire family chorused its delight at the proposal. Then Pam asked how soon they would go. Learning that her father had Friday in mind, she said, "Oh, Dad, that's the day of the dog show, remember? We've entered Zip in the children's class." "Of course we'll wait until after the show. I'd almost forgotten," answered Mr. Hollister. "After all, it comes only once a year. I'll try to get plane reservations for Saturday morning." Mrs. Hollister jumped to her feet. Her eyes were shining as brightly as those of the children. "It will be a splendid trip, but there's lots to be done before Saturday," she exclaimed. "The girls and I can shop after school tomorrow. Pete and Ricky will need some new clothes, too. I'll go with them on Wednesday afternoon." The next day, Pam, Holly, and Sue went with their mother to the largest department store in Shoreham. Zip was to have a new collar for the dog show, so he too went shopping. Since dogs were not allowed in the store, Pam fastened his leash to a parking meter nearby. The 3 girls had outgrown their bathing suits, so they stopped at that department first. Holly and Pam were led into a small fitting room to try on new suits, while Mrs. Hollister took Sue to the next booth. The 2 older girls had each donned a suit when they heard excited yells and running feet outside the fitting room. "What on earth?" Pam began, when suddenly there was a sharp, happy woof, and in bounded Zip, with an indignant clerk at his heels. "Oh, Zip!" Pam cried. "How did you get loose?" Mrs. Hollister and Sue rushed in. Pam and Holly were laughing and hugging Zip, while the saleswoman, who had been joined by the manager, both talked at once. "Please, please," Mrs. Hollister cried. "We'll take our dog out at once. We're very sorry he's caused such a disturbance." Turning to the collie, she said, "Zip, shame on you. Now come with me at once." Hanging his head and looking very sad, Zip slowly followed Mrs. Hollister out the door. Sue was told to stay in the other booth and look at a magazine. By the time Mrs. Hollister returned a few minutes later, Pam and Holly had chosen their swimsuits. Pam's was a bright yellow, and Holly's a red and white check. "Zip is waiting for us outside, and I'm sure he'll stay there now," Mrs. Hollister said, smiling. "While you're dressing, I'll go help Sue try on her suit." In a few seconds, the girls heard their mother calling Sue. "I guess she didn't stay there," Holly giggled. "Come on, let's hunt for her." They dressed hurriedly and went to join their mother, who had not yet found Sue. Mrs. Hollister hustled toward the elevators, while Pam and Holly ran to the other side of the building, where the escalators moved endlessly up and down. "Oh dear," sighed Pam. "I hope the little monkey hasn't tried to ride on this all by herself." But Sue was not on it, so the girls turned back. "Oh, see that crowd!" Pam cried, looking toward the infants department. A group of people were standing in a circle, apparently amused by something or someone the girls could not see. Pam and Holly, both struck with the same thought, started toward the spot. "Do you suppose it could be—" Pam began, and then she saw Sue. Their baby sister, clothed only in the briefest of bathing suits, was gazing lovingly at a doll that lay in a bassinet on display. She was entirely unaware of being the center of attention from smiling shoppers and saleswomen. Pam rushed over to her. "Sue," she said, "Mother's looking all over for you." "Do you like my new suit?" Sue asked as she was led away. "I was playing Forda." In a few minutes, the girls found their mother. Amid much giggling, Sue's street clothes were put on, and the new suit wrapped in a box. When they reached home, Mr. Hollister and the boys chuckled over the story of Sue's adventure. By Thursday evening, suitcases were practically packed, and the children could give all their attention to getting Zip ready for the dog show. Pam and Pete washed the collie, and after school on Friday, they brushed and brushed his coat until it gleamed. At 4 o'clock, Zip's young owners proudly led him to the armory, where the dog show was being held. What excitement there was! Inside the huge brick building, people were hurrying in all directions, and the dogs were barking as if impatient for their turns in the show. Eagerly, the Hollisters looked around for the children's class section. "There it is," Holly cried, and Pete led Zip over to the stall assigned to him. Right next to their collie, but in another section, was a beautiful white French poodle. On top of its enclosure was pinned a blue ribbon. "Oh, isn't he precious?" Pam exclaimed, as she and the others stopped by to admire the poodle before taking their seats nearby. Watching class after class of dogs being shown made Ricky restless, so he got up and started on a tour of inspection. When the boy returned to the others, he reported having found a door behind the row of stalls where Zip was located. Ricky had opened it because he wanted to give the dog some fresh air. "See how they're all panting?" he said. "I hope none of the prize dogs run away through that door, Ricky," Pam remarked. The Hollisters thought Zip's turn to be shown would never come. But finally the children's class was announced. Pam began to feel anxious. Would the collie respond to her directions as well today as he did at home? Soon she was leading her pet into the ring. How pleased she was to see the collie go through his paces without a moment's hesitation. "Think we've got a chance to win, Pete?" Ricky asked, tugging at his brother's sleeve. "I sure hope so," he said. Pam is a wonderful handler. See how obedient Zip is." After all the dogs in the children's class had been shown, the Hollister boys and Holly sat up straight, almost breathless with suspense. 3 judges were walking slowly back and forth in front of Zip and 2 other dogs. Finally, they wrote on slips of paper, and one of the men carried them to the committee table. The chairman looked at the slips, then picked up the first prize blue ribbon. The children felt their hearts pounding as the man began to speak. "The blue ribbon in the children's class for best all-round dog," he smiled, "goes to Miss Pam Hollister and her entry Zip." "Hooray!" cried Ricky, jumping up. "Hooray!" "We sure have a swell dog," Pete said. Just then Joey Brill, a tall, heavy-set boy of 12 who was always making trouble for the Hollisters, pushed through the crowd and walked over to Zip. Scowling, he said, "You Hollisters think you're the whole show, just because your old mutt got a little ribbon." "Pay no attention to him, Pete," Pam whispered as her brother made a move toward Joey. "He's jealous because he doesn't have a dog on the show." Ricky moved in between Joey and Pete and announced firmly that he was taking Zip outside for a breath of air. Holly said she would go along. Joey now turned his attention to a small terrier who was yipping in a nearby stall. Putting his face close to the excited little dog, the boy barked shrilly while he poked at the animal with his program. Suddenly there was a wild shout from Joey. "That beast bit me!" he shrieked. Mr. Brill, who was seated not far away, ran to his son's side. The dog's owner sprang to defend his pet. There were excited words. In the confusion, Pam's voice rang out. "It serves Joey right. He was teasing the terrier." The owner repeated the remark to the judges, who had come up to question the meaning of the disturbance. It would, of course, disqualify the terrier if he was proved vicious. Other people who had noticed the incident agreed with Pam, and Joey was asked to leave the armory at once. At this point, another commotion arose. A Mrs. Milton cried out that her prize-winning French poodle was missing from its stall beside Zip's. The children remembered the lovely animal well. As the crowd surged toward the section of the hall, Pam said to Pete, "Do you suppose Joey let him out?" Before the boy could answer, Holly came racing into the building through the rear door, her pigtails flying. "What's the matter?" Pam asked her, as the girl rushed up excitedly. Words tumbled over each other as she said quickly, "It's a man. He came running out the door Ricky opened. He had Mrs. Milton's white poodle under his arm. Zip's chasing him, and Ricky is too." Before Holly had finished her story, Pete was dashing out of the building with the girls after him. They could see Zip and Ricky going full speed after a man in a bright blue suit. Zip was gaining on him because the dog napper was being slowed down by the struggles of the poodle in his arms. "Get him, Zip!" Ricky shouted, and the other children took up the cry.